The tracks were too perfect. That was the first thing Elijah Cross noticed as he crouched beside the muddy riverbank, his weathered fingers tracing the outline of massive paw prints pressed deep into the earth. No animal left marks this clean, this deliberate, almost like it wanted to be followed. 3 weeks of sleepless nights had brought him to this moment. 3 weeks of finding his cattle with throats torn open, their bodies drained but barely touched. 3 weeks of hearing that low, rumbling growl echoing through the canyon walls each night, growing bolder, coming closer to his ranch house with each passing darkness. Elijah had seen plenty of predators in his 47 years working this land. Mountain lions, wolves, even the occasional bear wandering down from the northern ridges. But this creature moved differently. It hunted differently. The way it stalked his property suggested an intelligence that made his skin crawl with unease. He stood slowly, his joints protesting after the long morning ride. The sun hung directly overhead, casting sharp shadows across the rocky terrain that bordered his ranch. To the east lay miles of open grazing land, where his remaining cattle huddled together in nervous groups. To the west stretched the mouth of Dead Horse Canyon, a jagged scar in the earth that most locals avoided after sunset. The tracks led straight toward that canyon. Ethan Harrow had warned him yesterday, riding over with concern etched deep in his lined face. "Leave it be, Elijah. Whatever's out there, it ain't natural. Lost 2 of my own steers last month, but I got sense enough to cut my losses." His neighbor had gripped his reins tighter, casting nervous glances toward the canyon. Some things are better left alone, but Elijah couldn't leave it alone. Not when the creature had taken 8 of his cattle, not when it had started circling his house at night, leaving those perfect prints in the dirt around his front porch like some kind of calling card. Not when he'd glimpsed its shadow moving between the oak trees, larger than any panther had a right to be. His rifle felt heavy across his shoulders as he mounted his horse, a steady roan mare named Clara, who'd never failed him in rough country. The tracks were fresh, maybe 2 hours old based on how the edges held their shape in the drying mud. If he moved quickly, he might catch up before the creature reached the deep canyon where tracking would become nearly impossible. Clara snorted and shifted beneath him, her ears flicking toward the canyon mouth. Even she sensed something wrong about this pursuit. Animals possessed instincts that often proved wiser than human logic, but Elijah had moved beyond the luxury of common sense. This predator had made his land its hunting ground, and that was something no rancher could tolerate. The tracks curved away from the river, following a game trail that wound between scattered boulders and scrub brush. Each print showed the same disturbing precision, pressed into the earth with a weight that seemed impossible for any natural panther. As Elijah urged Clara forward, following the trail that led inevitably toward Dead Horse Canyon, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something far more dangerous than a simple hunt. But what he discovered in that canyon would prove that some predators were worth following, no matter how perfect their tracks appeared. The canyon walls rose like ancient sentinels on either side of Elijah, as Clara picked her way carefully along the narrow trail. 60 feet of sheer rock stretched above him, creating a natural corridor where sound echoed strangely, and shadows lingered even under the midday sun. The tracks remained clearly visible in the sandy canyon floor, each print still showing that same unsettling precision. After an hour of steady riding, the trail split into 3 separate paths. Elijah dismounted and studied the ground carefully, his experienced eyes reading the story written in dust and stone. The panther had paused here, its tracks showing a circular pattern as if it had tested each direction. Then something made Elijah's blood run cold. Fresh boot prints. Human boot prints running alongside the panther tracks. He knelt closer, his mind racing. The boot prints were small, probably belonging to a woman or young person. They showed signs of haste and stumbling, pressed deep into the sand as if the person had been running hard. But what froze him completely was their direction. They weren't running away from the panther tracks. They were running alongside them, matching pace for pace. "What in blazes?" Elijah muttered, following the combined trail with his eyes. Both sets of tracks led down the middle path, which wound deeper into the canyon's heart, where the walls grew narrower and the shadows darker. Clara stamped nervously, her nostrils flaring as she caught scents that made her ears flatten against her skull. Elijah had learned to trust his horse's instincts, and everything about Clara's posture screamed danger. But the mystery of those human tracks pulled at him like a hook in his chest. Who would be running through this canyon with a predator? And why weren't there signs of struggle or blood? He remounted and urged Clara forward, following the strange dual trail deeper into the canyon. The walls grew so narrow that in places his knees nearly brushed the rock faces. Above, the strip of sky had shrunk to a thin blue line, making the canyon floor feel like the bottom of a grave. Then he heard it, a voice, echoing off the canyon walls from somewhere ahead. A woman's voice, speaking in low, urgent tones. The words were too distant to understand, but the tone carried clearly. She wasn't calling for help. She was giving commands. Elijah dismounted again and tied Clara's reins to a stunted juniper tree that had somehow found purchase in the rocky soil. He pulled his rifle from its saddle holster and moved forward on foot, staying close to the canyon wall where his shadow would blend with the natural darkness. The voice grew clearer as he advanced, and what he heard made his hands tighten on his weapon. The woman was definitely giving commands, her voice firm and controlled. But she wasn't speaking to another person. The responding sounds, low rumbles and soft chuffs, could only be coming from the panther itself. Elijah crept around a bend in the canyon and stopped dead. In a small clearing ahead, partially hidden by a cluster of boulders, he could see movement. A figure in dark clothing crouched beside something large and black. The figure moved with purpose, checking something on the ground while the distinctive silhouette of a massive panther paced in a tight circle nearby. The woman looked up suddenly, her head turning toward Elijah's position, as if she'd sensed his presence. Even from 50 yards away he could see her eyes, pale and calculating, studying the canyon walls with the same predatory awareness as the creature beside her. What Elijah witnessed next would shatter everything he thought he knew about the predator terrorizing his land. The woman was feeding the panther. Elijah watched in stunned silence as she reached into a leather satchel and pulled out strips of raw meat, tossing them to the massive black cat with practiced ease. The panther caught each piece delicately, its movements showing none of the wild aggression he'd expected from the creature that had been terrorizing his ranch. But that wasn't what made his blood turn to ice water. Scattered around the clearing were pieces of rope, metal stakes, and what looked like crude snares. The woman wasn't just feeding the panther, she was setting traps. And from the fresh scratches on the nearby rocks and the torn fabric caught on thorns, it was clear this wasn't the first time they'd used this location. The woman stood slowly, brushing dust from her dark trousers. She was younger than Elijah had first thought, maybe 25, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid. But her movements held a confidence that spoke of years spent in wild country, and the knife on her belt showed the wear of frequent use. She turned toward the panther and made a series of soft clicking sounds with her tongue. The big cat responded immediately, padding over to sit beside her like an oversized house cat. That's when Elijah noticed the thin scar running along the panther's left flank, a long, pale line that could only have come from a rope burn. His mind raced as pieces fell into place. This creature hadn't been hunting his cattle for food. It had been stealing them for this woman, bringing them here to this hidden canyon clearing where she could butcher them without being seen. The perfect tracks weren't the result of some supernatural intelligence. They were the carefully placed steps of a trained animal following familiar routes. But why? What would drive someone to train a panther to steal cattle? And how had she managed to domesticate such a dangerous predator? The woman suddenly froze, her head snapping toward Elijah's position. The panther's ears perked up simultaneously, and both turned to stare directly at the boulder where he was hiding. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the woman reached slowly for the rifle leaning against a nearby rock. "I know you're there," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "Been watching you follow our trail for the better part of an hour. Question is, what do you plan to do about what you've seen?" Elijah felt his heart hammering against his ribs. His own rifle was ready, but the distance was too great for an accurate shot, especially with the panther now standing alert beside its handler. One wrong move and that massive cat could cover the 50 yards between them faster than he could work his rifle's bolt action. "Name's Elijah Cross," he called back, keeping his voice steady. "Those are my cattle you've been taking." The woman laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Your cattle, your land. Everything's always someone's property, isn't it?" She kept her hand near her rifle but didn't raise it. "Tell me, Mr. Cross, what would you do if someone took away the only family you had left?" The panther began pacing again, but this time its movement seemed more agitated. Its yellow eyes never left Elijah's position, and he could see the powerful muscles bunching under its black coat. Whatever bond existed between the woman and the predator, it was strong enough that the cat was clearly prepared to defend her. That animal has killed 8 of my steers, Elijah said, slowly rising from behind the boulder, with his hands visible but ready. I've got a right to protect my property. Property. The woman spat the word like a curse. Everything's just property to you people, isn't it? Well, let me tell you something about your property, Mr. Cross. This canyon belongs to Luna and me now. Has for 3 years. And if you think you can just walk in here and take her away from me? She never finished the sentence. A gunshot echoed off the canyon walls from somewhere behind Elijah, and the woman's eyes widened in alarm as she recognized what that sound meant. More riders were coming, and from the sound of their horses' hooves echoing through the narrow passages, they were coming fast. 3 riders emerged from the canyon's mouth, their horses lathered with sweat from hard riding. Elijah recognized the lead figure immediately, Sheriff Morton Blackwood, his badge glinting in the filtered sunlight. Behind him rode 2 deputies, both carrying rifles across their saddles and wearing the grim expressions of men expecting trouble. The woman's reaction was immediate and telling. She grabbed her rifle and whistled sharply, a sound that sent the Panther bounding toward a cluster of rocks at the far end of the clearing. The big cat disappeared into what Elijah now realized was probably a cave entrance, hidden behind fallen boulders. Luna Hayes, Sheriff Blackwood called out, as his horse picked its way carefully down the narrow trail into the clearing. Been looking for you for 3 days now. Luna. So that was her name, not the Panther's. Elijah remained crouched behind his boulder, uncertain whether to reveal himself or wait to see how this confrontation played out. The sheriff's presence suggested this situation was more complicated than simple cattle theft. Don't suppose you're here for a social visit, Morton, Luna replied, her rifle now held casually but ready. Last I checked, being in a canyon wasn't against the law. Sheriff Blackwood dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his pistol grip. Depends on what you're doing in the canyon. Got reports of missing cattle from 3 different ranches, all showing the same strange predator marks we've been tracking back to you. Interesting theory, Luna said, taking a step backward toward the rocks where the Panther had vanished. You got any proof of that? Or just more of Jacob Morrison's wild stories? At the mention of Morrison's name, Elijah felt his jaw clench. Jacob Morrison owned the largest ranch in the territory and had been trying to buy out smaller landowners for years. If Morrison was involved in this hunt, it meant more than just missing cattle was at stake. Mr. Morrison's offered a substantial reward for information leading to the capture of this predator. One of the deputies spoke up. Dead or alive? Luna's expression hardened. Of course he has. Let me guess. He's also generously offered to buy up any land that's been affected by these attacks? Help out his poor struggling neighbors? The sheriff's uncomfortable silence confirmed Luna's suspicion. Elijah began to understand why she looked more angry than afraid. Morrison had a reputation for using every possible method to pressure smaller ranchers into selling their land, and a predator attacking livestock would certainly drive down property values. Look, Luna, Sheriff Blackwood said, his tone softening slightly. I know you've had it rough since your father died. Know you've been living rough up here in the canyon. But this has gone too far. People are scared, and scared people do dangerous things. My father was murdered, Morton. Luna's voice turned cold as winter steel. Shot down in his own yard by Morrison's men, and you know it. Don't talk to me about people being scared when you've done nothing about the real criminal in this territory. Elijah felt the pieces clicking together. Luna Hayes, he remembered now. Her father, Samuel Hayes, had owned a small ranch on the eastern border of Morrison's property. 6 months ago, Samuel had been found dead in his yard, officially ruled a hunting accident despite the suspicious circumstances. That investigation is still ongoing, the sheriff said weakly. Investigation. Luna laughed bitterly. Right. While you're investigating, Morrison's been buying up every piece of land that borders his property. Amazing how many folks suddenly want to sell after their livestock starts disappearing. The Panther's roar echoed from the hidden cave, a sound that made all 3 horses shy nervously. The big cat was agitated, probably sensing the tension in the clearing. Luna whistled again, softer this time, and the sound stopped. Sheriff Blackwood drew his pistol. That's enough, Luna. You're coming with us. And that animal, Luna interrupted, is the only family I have left. And I'll die before I let Morrison's bought lawman put her down. The canyon suddenly felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. The standoff lasted exactly 3 heartbeats before everything went wrong. One of the deputies shifted his rifle toward the cave entrance where the Panther was hidden, and Luna reacted instinctively. Her shot cracked across the canyon, kicking up dust inches from the deputy's horse. The animal reared, throwing its rider hard against the canyon wall. "Next one won't miss," Luna called out, working her rifle's bolt with practiced speed. Sheriff Blackwood raised his pistol toward Luna, but Elijah made a decision that surprised even himself. He stood up from behind his boulder, his rifle trained on the sheriff. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Morton." The sheriff spun toward the new voice, his face showing recognition and confusion in equal measure. "Elijah Cross? What in blazes are you doing here?" "Same thing you are, I reckon. Tracking the predator that's been taking my cattle." Elijah kept his weapon steady, though his heart was racing. "But seems like there's more to this story than I first thought." "Don't be a fool, Cross," the remaining mounted deputy said. "She's got a trained killer in those rocks. That thing could attack any of us." "Could," Elijah agreed, "but hasn't. Been 3 weeks of this panther being on my land, and it never once went after me or my horse. Only took cattle. Makes a man wonder why a supposedly wild predator would be so selective." Luna's eyes met his across the clearing, and he saw a flicker of something that might have been gratitude. "Your cattle were always returned to the open range," she said. "Never killed, never harmed. Just moved away from Morrison's line of sight when his men came scouting for expansion opportunities." The truth hit Elijah like a physical blow. His cattle hadn't been killed by the panther. They'd been herded away from his property to protect them from Morrison's men, who had been known to shoot livestock that wandered onto disputed land. Luna had been protecting his herd, not decimating it. "You've been moving my cattle to keep them safe," he said, understanding flooding through him. "Morrison's been planning to claim your eastern pasture for months," Luna confirmed. "Same way he took the Henderson place and the Miller Ranch. Create a crisis, offer a solution, then buy the land cheap when desperate people have no choice left." Sheriff Blackwood looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Look, I don't know anything about Morrison's business dealings. I'm just here to stop a dangerous predator from..." "From what?" Elijah interrupted. "From protecting livestock? From stopping a land grab? Seems to me the most dangerous predator in this territory wears a suit and carries legal papers." The panther's roar echoed from the cave again, but this time it sounded different. Not angry or territorial. Warning. Luna's head snapped toward the sound, her face going pale. "Someone else is coming," she whispered. "Luna always warns me when strangers approach from the North Passage." The sound of hooves on stone drifted down from the canyon's upper reaches, but these riders weren't moving with the careful pace of lawmen. They were moving fast, with the urgency of men who had business to finish and didn't care who got in their way. Morrison's men had found them. 5 riders descended into the canyon like a thunderstorm given human form. At their head rode Jacob Morrison himself, his expensive black coat a stark contrast to the rough working clothes of the 4 gunmen flanking him. Morrison's pale eyes swept the clearing, taking in the tense standoff with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through force or money. "Well, well," Morrison said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. "Sheriff Blackwood, Mr. Cross, and the elusive Miss Hayes." His smile held no warmth. "Saves me the trouble of hunting you down separately." Luna kept her rifle trained on the sheriff, but Elijah could see her hands trembling slightly. 5 armed men plus the sheriff and his remaining deputy made 7 guns against 2. The odds had shifted dramatically against them. "Morrison," Sheriff Blackwood said, relief evident in his voice. "Good timing. We've got the situation contained." "Contained?" Morrison laughed, dismounting from his horse with practiced ease. "Sheriff, you have a wanted criminal holding a rifle on you while harboring a dangerous predator. I'd hardly call that contained." He gestured to his men, who spread out in a practiced formation that blocked all escape routes from the clearing. Elijah felt his mouth go dry as he recognized 2 of Morrison's hired guns. The Caldwell brothers, known throughout the territory for their willingness to handle problems that required permanent solutions. Both men wore their pistols low and loose, and their eyes held the flat, emotionless stare of professional killers. "Now then," Morrison continued, his tone becoming businesslike. "Miss Hayes, you're going to put down that rifle and surrender yourself to the sheriff's custody. Your trained animal is going to be put down as a public menace. And Mr. Cross," his gaze shifted to Elijah with undisguised contempt, "you're going to sell me your eastern pasture at a fair price, and forget everything you've seen here today." "And if we refuse?" Luna asked, though they all knew the answer. Morrison's smile widened. Then I'm afraid you'll be shot while resisting arrest. Tragic, really. But sometimes justice requires difficult decisions. The panther's roar echoed from the cave again, longer and more agitated this time. The big cat could sense the tension in the air, and Elijah wondered how long Luna could keep her trained companion hidden before instinct drove the animal to defend its handler. "You killed her father," Elijah said, the words coming out harder than he'd intended. "Samuel Hayes was murdered on your orders." "Samuel Hayes was shot by unknown assailants during a hunting accident," Morrison corrected smoothly. "The sheriff's investigation found no evidence of foul play. Isn't that right?" "Sheriff?" Sheriff Blackwood's silence was answer enough. The man was either bought or intimidated into compliance, possibly both. Either way, justice wouldn't come through official channels. "Here's what's going to happen," Morrison continued, pulling a leather document case from his saddlebag. "Miss Hayes is going to confess to training a predator to attack livestock, destroying property, and threatening law enforcement. Mr. Cross is going to sell me his land for a generous sum that will more than compensate for his recent losses. Everyone walks away alive and prosperous." Luna's laugh was bitter as desert wind. "Except for my father. Except for the Henderson family. Except for everyone else you've driven off their land or into their graves." Morrison's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "People make choices, Miss Hayes. Some choose to adapt to changing circumstances. Others choose to resist progress." He nodded toward the Caldwell brothers. "And some choices have consequences." That's when the panther decided the threat had become too great to ignore. A low growl echoed from the cave entrance, and Elijah saw a shadow moving among the rocks. Luna's eyes widened in alarm as she realized her companion was preparing to emerge, despite her earlier commands to stay hidden. "Luna, no," she whispered, but it was too late. The massive black cat stepped into view, its yellow eyes fixed on Morrison with predatory intensity. 7 men with guns suddenly found themselves facing not just 2 desperate people, but 150 pounds of muscle, claws, and protective instinct. Morrison's horse shied backward, nearly throwing him. "Kill it," he snapped. "Kill them all." The canyon erupted into chaos. The Caldwell brothers went for their guns first, but the panther moved faster than anyone expected. The big cat launched itself not at the men, but at their horses, its training evident in how it targeted the animal's legs, rather than going for killing strikes. 2 horses went down immediately, throwing their riders hard against the rocky ground. Elijah dove behind his boulder as gunfire exploded across the clearing. Luna rolled toward a fallen log, her rifle cracking as she returned fire. Sheriff Blackwood's horse bolted for the canyon mouth, carrying the lawman away from the fight despite his efforts to control the terrified animal. Morrison's remaining men struggled to get clear shots while their mounts bucked and reared in panic. The panther's presence had turned what should have been a simple execution into a nightmare of confused animals and scattered positioning. The big cat had vanished again among the rocks, but its psychological effect lingered. Every shadow could hide a predator. Every sound might signal another attack. "Spread out!" Morrison shouted over the gunfire. "Find that animal and put it down." But Elijah had noticed something crucial during the initial chaos. When the panther attacked the horses, it had moved with purpose toward the canyon's northern passage, the same route Morrison's men had used to enter. The cat wasn't randomly attacking. It was following Luna's training to cut off escape routes and control the battlefield. One of the Caldwell brothers rose from behind his fallen horse, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. He spotted Luna behind her log and raised his pistol, but Elijah's rifle spoke first. The gunman spun and fell, clutching his shoulder. "Behind you," Luna shouted, and Elijah spun to see another of Morrison's men taking aim from higher ground. Luna's shot took the man in the chest, dropping him instantly. Morrison himself had taken cover behind a cluster of boulders, his expensive coat now torn and dusty. "You fools!" he screamed at his remaining men. "It's just one girl and a rancher. Kill them!" The surviving Caldwell brother and Morrison's last gunman began advancing on Luna's position, using the scattered rocks for cover. Elijah tried to get a clear shot, but the angle was wrong. Luna was trapped, and she was running low on ammunition. That's when the panther reappeared. The big cat emerged from a crevice directly behind Morrison's position, moving with the silent grace that had made it such an effective hunter. It didn't attack immediately. Instead, it sat down about 10 feet behind Morrison and let out a single, rumbling growl. Morrison spun around and found himself face to face with over 100 pounds of muscle and predatory intelligence. His pistol shook in his hands as he raised it toward the panther, but the cat simply watched him with those unblinking yellow eyes, its tail twitching slightly. "Shoot it!" Morrison screamed to his men, but they were too far away and focused on Luna to help him. "Here's the thing about trained animals, Morrison," Luna called out from behind her log. "They follow commands, and I trained her very well." Luna made a soft clicking sound with her tongue, the same sound Elijah had heard her use earlier. The panther's ears perked up, and it took a single step forward. Morrison's nerve broke completely. He fired wild, his shot going wide, and tried to run. The panther didn't pursue. It simply sat down again and watched as Morrison stumbled and fell in his panic, landing hard on the rocky ground and dropping his weapon. The man who had terrorized an entire territory with threats and violence was reduced to cowering before an animal that could have killed him, but chose not to. "Surrender!" Luna shouted to the remaining gunmen. "Your boss is finished, and you're outnumbered." The surviving Caldwell brother looked at Morrison writhing on the ground, then at his wounded partner, then at the panther watching everything with calm intelligence. He slowly raised his hands above his head. "We're done," he called out. "This job ain't worth dying for." But as the dust settled and victory seemed assured, Elijah heard the sound that made his blood run cold. More hooves approaching from the South Passage. Sheriff Blackwood was returning, and this time he wasn't alone. The riders who emerged from the South Passage weren't more of Morrison's men. Sheriff Blackwood rode at the head of a federal marshal and 3 territorial rangers, their badges gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. Behind them came Ethan Harrow and 2 other neighboring ranchers, all armed and looking grimly determined. "Federal Marshal William Grant," the lead rider announced as he surveyed the scene of scattered weapons and defeated gunmen. "Got some interesting testimony from Sheriff Blackwood here about land fraud and conspiracy to commit murder." Morrison struggled to his feet, his expensive clothes torn and dusty. "Marshal, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. These people attacked me and my employees while we were conducting legitimate business." "Save it, Morrison." The marshal dismounted and pulled a set of documents from his saddlebag. "We've been investigating your land acquisition methods for 6 months. Sheriff Blackwood finally decided his conscience was worth more than your money." Elijah looked at the sheriff in surprise. Blackwood's face was pale but determined as he addressed the group. "Morrison threatened my family if I didn't cooperate, but when he ordered me to watch while his men gunned down unarmed people," he shook his head. "Some lines you don't cross." Luna emerged from behind her log, still holding her rifle but with a look of cautious hope replacing the desperate determination that had driven her for months. The panther padded out from the rocks to sit beside her, calm now that the immediate threat had passed. "Miss Hayes," Marshal Grant said formally, "I have federal warrants for Jacob Morrison and his associates on charges of conspiracy, fraud, intimidation, and the murder of your father, Samuel Hayes. Your testimony and the evidence you've gathered will be crucial to ensuring these men face justice." Morrison's face went white. "You can't prove anything. I have legitimate bills of sale for every piece of property. Bills of sale obtained through threats, violence, and murder," the marshal interrupted. "We have witnesses now, Morrison. People willing to testify about your methods. Your empire built on fear ends today." Ethan Harrow rode forward, relief evident on his weathered features. "Elijah, Luna, when Sheriff Blackwood came to my place talking about federal marshals and Morrison's schemes, we knew we had to help. Been too long that decent folks lived in fear of that snake." The surviving members of Morrison's gang were quickly restrained by the rangers. The wounded men would be treated and transported to face trial along with their employer. Morrison himself stood in shocked silence as the marshal read the charges against him, his carefully constructed facade of respectability crumbling like a house built on sand. "What about the panther?" one of the rangers asked, eyeing Luna's companion nervously. "Luna stays with me," Luna said firmly, her hand resting on the big cat's head. "She's never harmed anyone who didn't threaten us first. And now that Morrison's finished, there won't be any need for her to protect anyone's livestock." Marshal Grant studied the panther thoughtfully. "Animal seems well trained and under control. Long as she stays on your property and doesn't bother the neighbors, I don't see any federal jurisdiction issues. She can stay in the canyon," Luna said. "It's been our home for 3 years now. Remote enough that she won't encounter people unless they're looking for trouble." Elijah stepped forward. "Actually, I've got a proposal about that." He looked at Luna seriously. "My ranch borders this canyon. Been thinking I could use a partner who knows the land and has experience with Unusual security measures. If you're interested in a legitimate way to make a living. Luna's eyes widened in surprise. You'd trust me after everything that's happened? You saved my cattle and risked your life fighting corruption, Elijah replied. Figure that makes you more trustworthy than most folks around here. As the sun began to set behind the canyon walls, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the last chapter of Morrison's reign of terror came to a close. The man who had used fear and violence to steal land and destroy lives was led away in chains. Luna Hayes finally had justice for her father's murder, and in the remote canyon where it all began, a rancher, a woman, and her extraordinary companion prepared to build something better from the ashes of the old corruption. The tracks in the canyon floor would fade with the next rain, but the courage it took to follow them had changed everything. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale, where courage and justice collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.
They didn't mean to adopt a wild animal. It was never part of the plan. No vision board, no childhood dream of raising a creature that once roamed forests alone under the stars. But sometimes life doesn't wait for permission. It simply walks into your world on 4 trembling legs and looks at you like it's always known you. It started with a sound, not a howl, not a meow, just something in between, a cry that didn't belong to the wind or the woods. A cry that seemed to carry with it a question: will anyone come? That morning, as the mist rolled across the tall grass of Cedar Hollow, something ancient stirred a soft collision between the wild and the domestic, between instinct and memory. And when they found him muddy, broken, staring not at them, but through them, it wasn't rescue, it was a reunion. What happens when the wild chooses you? And what if it never really leaves, even when it starts sleeping on your favorite blanket like it owns the place? This is not a story about taming a predator. It's about what happens when you let a spirit from the forest live between your walls, curl beside your fireplace, and somehow softly, stubbornly reshape the way you understand love, responsibility, and home. Because this couple adopted a wildcat baby, and now he sleeps like a spoiled house cat. But what they didn't expect was how he would transform them. Most boys Harold's age grew up with soccer balls or bikes or video games, but Harold Boone grew up with silence and trees. While other kids learned to navigate sidewalks and city blocks, Harold learned to read the forest floor. Each bent fern, each snapped twig, each shifting wind held meaning. His childhood wasn't loud, but it was alive. He was raised by his grandmother in a moss-covered cabin tucked deep into the Blue Ridge foothills of eastern Tennessee. It was a place where the radio worked only on dry mornings and the only neighbors were deer and owls. His grandmother, Miriam, was a quiet woman with strong hands, a crooked spine, and a reverence for nature that bordered on the mystical. She believed that the woods listened, and sometimes if you were quiet long enough, they spoke back. Harold never questioned her. He would sit on the porch beside her barefoot and still watching shadows move through the undergrowth. He learned early that stillness brought reward: a fox trotting across a clearing, the delicate steps of a wild turkey, the glint of amber eyes peeking from behind brambles. While other kids were told bedtime stories, Miriam whispered herbal charms and old Appalachian lore. Some creatures, she'd say, aren't meant to be owned, but they might choose to stay if they feel seen. By the time Harold turned 12, he had found his way of listening through the lens of a second-hand Nikon his grandmother found at a church rummage sale. At first, he took blurry photos of squirrels and spiderwebs, but slowly, with time and patience, his images began to capture something deeper: a bear pausing mid-step, a hawk's shadow falling across an open field, the stillness before a storm. He didn't just photograph animals, he photographed presence. His passion became a path. By his late 20s, Harold's photographs had been featured in regional wildlife journals. By 30, he was traveling across the southern states, capturing the hidden lives of bobcats, foxes, and river otters. He never saw himself as an artist. He called it bearing witness. But there was one rule he always followed, one that Miriam had etched into his heart: never interfere. Nature is wiser than we are, she once said. Don't pretend you're the hero in a story that doesn't belong to you. So Harold watched. He followed. He waited. But he never touched. Until the day the forest cried. That morning, he was tracking a white-tailed doe through the valley, hoping to catch a sunbeam moment, the kind where light cuts through branches just right, where an animal forgets it's being watched and reveals its truth. His camera hung ready. The wind was perfect, the setting still. And then came the sound. At first, he thought it was a bird, a warble or chirp caught in the leaves. But it was wetter, raw. A sound that didn't rise, it clung. It came again, short, trembling, and undeniably out of place. Not a call, but a question. Not a warning, but a wound. Harold lowered his camera. He stepped off the trail, moving through ferns and fallen branches, following the pull of that fragile voice. 50 steps, then 70, then 100. And finally, under a twisted pine, half buried beneath a rotting log, he saw it. A small shape, barely breathing, covered in mud and dried blood. Eyes closed, chest heaving in sharp, uneven pulls. A bobcat kitten, no bigger than a house cat, but wild. Its hind leg bent unnaturally. One ear was torn, fur matted. But what stopped Harold wasn't the injuries, it was the presence. The silence around the creature seemed to shift, as if the forest itself had drawn a breath. And for the first time in his life, Harold broke his rule. He reached out. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was everything his grandmother had taught him. Maybe, just maybe, it was the echo of an old Appalachian truth: the wild sees the wild in you. He wrapped the kitten in his flannel, whispering nothing in particular, just sound and warmth. He didn't know if the creature would live, but something inside him had already decided it had to be given a chance. What Harold didn't know then was that this single act, this fracture in a lifetime of silent witness, would become the most meaningful photo he would never take. And it wasn't just him. Across town, his wife Clara, hands deep in another emergency surgery at the regional wildlife clinic, felt her phone buzz. Harold rarely called during the day. He preferred long messages at night, always starting with, "You won't believe what I saw today." But this time the message was different. Just 5 words: "I found something. It's bad." Clara knew his tone. She heard the crack beneath the calm. And when she saw what Harold carried into the clinic 20 minutes later, something inside her shifted too. They named him Ash after the black soot that still clung to his fur and the tree he was found beneath. And perhaps unconsciously, for what he symbolized: the gray space between life and death, wilderness and warmth, memory and instinct. But Ash's story hadn't truly begun yet. What Harold and Clara were about to face would test not just their knowledge, but the very boundaries of what it means to love something that was never meant to be tamed. Because some creatures don't belong to anyone, and yet, sometimes they stay. Next, we step into that first moment: the cry in the woods, the touch that broke the rule, and the secret the forest revealed. The cry came again, thin, distant, almost unsure of itself. It rose from beneath the floor of the forest like a whisper trapped under centuries of leaves and roots. It didn't sound like something meant to be heard. It sounded like something meant to be lost. Harold stood still, camera still slung across his shoulder, heart oddly quiet. In the quietest moments, the forest around Cedar Hollow had a way of folding in on itself, like time slowing just enough to let something sacred pass through. And in that moment, he felt it, a thinning of the veil, the kind his grandmother used to speak of when the trees leaned in to listen. This wasn't just a cry for help. It was a thread pulling him off the path. He followed it not with urgency but with reverence, as if disturbing the silence too suddenly might sever whatever was waiting ahead. The moss grew thick around his boots. Ferns brushed his hands and sunlight filtered only in broken patterns through the canopy above. The smell of wet bark and decay filled the air, grounding him in the present. 40 steps in, he ducked beneath a leaning birch. 60 steps later, the sound changed, closer, now rawer. Not a bird, not a raccoon. Something in between. Something orphaned. He found the kitten beneath the roots of a toppled oak. The trunk had been hollowed with age and rain, forming a small pocket of space that had likely once been a den. Now it was a shallow grave of old leaves and broken branches, and in the center, a body barely breathing. A bobcat kitten no more than 12 weeks old. She, or rather he, was coated in drying mud and blood, one hind leg twisted unnaturally to the side. His ear was torn, his ribs too visible, his fur clumped with sap and soil. His eyes, though barely open, glinted yellow in the dimness, not with fear, but with the weariness of something that had waited too long. Harold didn't move at first. He simply knelt in the moss, letting the air settle between them. The kitten didn't flinch. He barely had the strength to lift his head. But there was a look not of pleading, not of desperation, but of awareness. He saw Harold, and Harold saw something in him that went beyond survival, a kind of quiet surrender, not to death, but to fate. And in that moment, Harold forgot every lecture, every rule, every word of warning he'd ever heard about interfering with the wild. He remembered only what his grandmother had once said, leaning in close by the firelight on a winter night. There are some cries that belong to the forest, but some are meant for us. Gently, he unwrapped the flannel jacket from around his waist and placed it over the kitten. The bobcat didn't resist. There was no fight left in him. And yet when Harold lifted him into his arms, he felt something soft stir, a tiny trembling breath pressed against his chest. Life. Still here. Still trying. The drive to the wildlife clinic blurred into memory. All Harold could remember was the way the little body shifted slightly with each breath, as if clinging to rhythm, refusing to let go. Clara met him at the back entrance, no questions, no panic, just swift, practiced hands and a look that said, "I know." They worked in near silence for over an hour. Clara cleaned the wounds while Harold held the kitten steady. Splints were applied, fluids given, and vitals monitored. Clara murmured something under her breath as she closed a gash along the kitten's side. Harold recognized the words. Not a prayer, but something older. A blessing from her grandmother's people in rural Kentucky. Words that had once soothed horses, cradled lambs, or mended broken birds. After the procedure, the kitten lay still on a heating pad in the back room, wrapped in a faded blue towel that once belonged to Harold's grandmother. He hadn't brought it on purpose. It was just there, as if something had known it would be needed. They named him Ash. Not because he looked broken, but because he looked like he'd already risen from something worse. Like the burnt remains of a forest floor ready for regrowth. Ash slept for almost 20 hours. When he stirred, it wasn't with a jolt or a growl. He opened his eyes slowly and blinked at the ceiling. Then, with visible effort, he turned his head to where Clara sat. Their eyes met for the first time. Harold saw it. That exact second. Something passed between them, not affection, not recognition, but presence. The kind that binds quietly and forever. Over the next few days, Clara and the team monitored Ash constantly. There were moments of doubt, times when he wouldn't eat, wouldn't move, or lie curled so tightly they feared he'd given up. But then a tiny sign, a lick of water, a blink at a shadow, a twitch of the ear at the sound of Clara's voice. He wasn't just recovering, he was deciding. And perhaps that's what made it different. It wasn't that Ash had been rescued. It was that he had chosen to stay. A week later, Clara found Harold sitting beside Ash's crate with the door wide open. The bobcat could have walked out, could have hidden, could have escaped into any corner of the clinic. But instead, he curled closer to Harold's boot and let out a low, breathy sigh, something between a growl and a hum. That was the first time Harold smiled in days. And maybe the first time Ash had in his way said thank you. But what they didn't know, what neither Harold nor Clara could yet imagine, was that this fragile little creature would soon change every rhythm in their life. From their mornings to their meals, their home to their hearts. Because while Ash was healing, he was also studying them, watching, learning, and preparing to step into a new kind of world, one with couches, carpet, and rules he would never follow. Next, we'll follow Ash's first days beyond the clinic. And the unexpected moment when he stopped seeing himself as a bobcat and started thinking of himself as family. Ash didn't purr, he didn't nuzzle their hands or curl up on command. He didn't do the things people expect when they imagine an animal bonding with a human. Instead, he watched still and silent from the corner of his crate, like a flame too cautious to flicker, and for days that's all he did, watch. Harold came every morning, coffee in hand, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the metal crate. He didn't speak much, just sat there reading an old paperback, letting the minutes pass. Now and then he would glance sideways. Ash would be staring right back, head low, ears relaxed, but alert, those golden eyes, neither afraid nor eager, just present. Clara noticed first the way Ash stopped flinching when someone entered the room, the way he began to shift his weight onto his front paws, tentatively testing his mended leg, the way he breathed not shallow and guarded but deeper, now slower, as if finally safe enough to rest. It wasn't recovery, it was remembering. Late one night, after the clinic had quieted and the last rescue case had been discharged, Clara stayed behind. She'd been reviewing charts, but found herself drawn almost involuntarily to Ash's room. The hallway was dim. Only the glow of a salt lamp cast a soft warmth across the floor. When she opened the door, she expected to find him curled in the far corner, tucked beneath his blanket. But instead, he was near the front, eyes open, waiting. Clara sat on the floor cross-legged like Harold always did. She didn't move any closer. She simply rested her hands on her knees and whispered, "It's okay." And then something remarkable happened. Ash stepped forward just once and pressed his nose lightly to the cage bars nearest her hand. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't affection, it was a question. "Are you real?" She didn't answer with words. She only stayed, and Ash didn't retreat. From that moment on, things began to shift. Tiny things. The way he walked to the water bowl when Clara entered as if signaling trust. The way his ears turned at Harold's laugh. The way he began to mimic the rhythm of the humans around him, not to become one of them, but to exist beside them. It wasn't domestication. It was a choice. Then came the night it all changed. Harold had dozed off in the chair beside Ash's crate. It was past midnight. Rain tapped softly on the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a thunderhead grumbled its way toward the valley. Clara was asleep in the recovery wing. The whole clinic breathed in the hush of night. Harold stirred from sleep when he felt warmth press against his boot. Ash. The crate door had been left slightly ajar, perhaps by mistake, perhaps by design. And Ash, healed enough to limp, had stepped out on his own. He hadn't fled. He hadn't disappeared into the shadows. Instead, he had crossed the room, climbed over a pile of folded towels, and nestled himself beside Harold's feet, half on the flannel jacket that had once wrapped his broken body, half on the hardwood floor. Harold barely moved. He just looked down, blinking through the haze of sleep and disbelief. Ash blinked up at him, slow and deliberate. Then, with a long, steady breath, he laid his head on Harold's boot. No sound, no ceremony, but in that quiet something sacred passed between them. A line redrawn. A boundary shifted. Ash had chosen them, not because they offered food or shelter, not because he was caged, but because somehow he had decided this was safe, that they were his. It's easy to assume love from an animal looks like tail wags, or purring or licking your hand. But some forms of trust come in quieter shapes, like silence beside your boot, or the courage it takes to close your eyes beside someone who once felt like a predator. From that night on, Ash was no longer the rescue case in Room B. He was Ash, their Ash. There were still challenges. Feeding him was a delicate task. Clara created a raw meat diet with careful ratios of organ meat and bone. He didn't always eat it, preferring to chew on the wooden corners of his crate when bored. Harold built him a custom perch out of repurposed cedar, and Ash would sit on it for hours, staring through the clinic window watching the night. But he stayed, and more importantly, he returned. Every time the door was left open, Ash would explore, but he never vanished. There was always a point just before dawn when he would reappear in the hallway, brush past Clara's legs, and settle again near Harold's chair, as if drawn not by habit but by gravity. And slowly their world began to shift around him. One morning, Clara asked a question she'd been holding in her heart for weeks. What happens when he's ready to go home? Harold looked at Ash, curled up near the heater paws, twitching slightly in sleep. He didn't answer. Because they both knew home wasn't a place anymore, it was a presence. Coming up next, the journey to turn that presence into permanence. How two people guided only by instinct and love navigated the laws, the limits and the lines between wild and welcome. For most people, bringing someone home means unlocking the front door, opening your arms and saying, "This is yours now too." But what if that someone has claws sharp enough to slice drywall, instincts older than firelight, and a gaze that still drips with the memory of moonlit hunting grounds? What if home isn't something you give but something you earn? Harold and Clara Boone knew Ash wasn't a pet. He was no house cat to be litter-trained and spoon-fed. He was something else, a creature with one paw in their world and the other still rooted in the wild. But he had chosen them. That choice echoed like a silent vow. And now it was their turn to make a choice. Would they fight for the right to keep him? The laws weren't written for stories like theirs. In the state of Tennessee, bobcats are classified as Class 1 wildlife, meaning, in short, you don't just bring them home. You petition, you prove, you submit yourself to a long, winding maze of background checks, veterinary reports, land assessments, interviews, home inspections, and most difficult of all, doubt. Clara sat at the kitchen table late one night, filling out the third draft of their wildlife possession application. Beside her, a stack of documents teetered precariously: vaccination records, property maps, behavior logs, feeding schedules. Her pen hovered over the question that always caught her breath. What is the intended purpose of possession? She hesitated, then wrote in quiet script, because he came to us. Outside the window, Ash sat motionless on the porch railing, eyes glowing faintly in the night. He wasn't watching them. He was listening to something else, something deep in the trees. The forest hadn't stopped calling him, but he hadn't left. The twist came not from the state, but from their hearts. A letter arrived midweek, a formal reminder from the Department of Wildlife stating that if the permit was denied, Ash would need to be transferred to a certified facility immediately. Clara reread the line 3 times, her hands trembling slightly. Transferred, they wrote. Not rehomed, not adopted, just removed. It didn't say what would happen to him if no space could be found. The room felt colder. Harold didn't speak for a long time that evening. He simply walked into Ash's room, sat on the floor, and placed his hand on the wood beside the sleeping bobcat. Not touching, just close. After a moment, he whispered, "What if they don't see you the way we do?" It was a question more for himself than for Ash, but it hung in the air like mist. How do you explain to someone in an office, someone who files forms and clicks checkboxes, that a wild creature can become part of your soul? And deeper still, have you ever loved something that wasn't meant to stay and yet couldn't bear to let it go? That night, they drove out past the city line into the mountains, into memory. They needed clarity. Clara suggested visiting her great-aunt's property, now long abandoned, where she'd once spent summers beneath pine trees and red-winged blackbirds. The house was falling apart, vines reclaiming the porch moss curling into the wood, but it still held something sacred. Something was still breathing beneath the rot. They brought Ash with them, safely crated, but left the doors open as they sat beneath the tree where Clara had buried her first dog, where she'd once whispered prayers to the wind long before she knew what faith was. The air was cool. The woods hushed. And then there it was. Ash stepped out of the crate on his own, not to flee, not to hide, but to walk a slow circle around them, his tail, low ears flicking. He rubbed his face gently against the edge of the old porch step, then sat, still and proud, like he belonged there. It was a small thing, but it felt holy, a confirmation. Clara felt tears sting without warning. Harold rested a hand on her back. "Maybe it's not about proving we deserve him," she said softly. "Maybe it's about proving we're willing to carry what he is." That moment became their anchor. Back home, they doubled down. Harold sketched out new fence designs for their property, tall enough to contain a bobcat, deep enough to prevent digging. Clara wrote a 10-page enrichment plan citing scientific literature on captive wildcat stress reduction. They installed security cameras, reinforced windows, spoke to neighbors, and submitted everything again. Weeks passed. Then one morning, as dew still clung to the lavender outside their door, a plain envelope arrived. Clara held it in her hands like a relic. Inside one page, no ceremony, just approval. Ash was theirs, not as a pet, not as property, but as a protected responsibility. That evening, they didn't celebrate with wine or music. Instead, Harold built a fire. Clara sat on the floor brushing Ash's fur with a soft bristle comb, while the bobcat lay half asleep, purring, not like a house cat, but with a deeper sound. A hum from some forgotten place. It wasn't the end of their worries. It was the beginning of new ones. But something had changed. The world had said yes to what their hearts already knew. And Ash, as if sensing the shift, curled up on the old woven rug like it had always been his. The wild had entered their home, and now it would never fully leave. I hope this little bobcat stays with you long after the screen fades. And if you feel like helping this story reach someone else, super thanks is your gentle ripple forward. But next came the hardest lesson of all, living together in a space not designed for the wild, and discovering that love, no matter how deep, does not erase instinct. Ash didn't just enter their home. He inhabited it like the wind filling a hollow space or smoke curling into unseen corners. The first few nights were quiet enough. He explored cautiously, padded through the kitchen like a thief, unsure of the rules, sniffed the hallway as though expecting it to stretch into the forest. But by the end of the first week, it became clear Ash wasn't adapting to the house. The house was adapting to him. The first sign came at dawn. Clara stepped into the living room, bleary-eyed, searching for coffee, and stopped cold. Ash was sprawled across the back of the couch, head tilted, just so, watching the birds flicker across the feeder outside. His body rose and fell in a slow rhythm, utterly at ease. It was her grandmother's sofa, the one no pet had ever been allowed on. And Ash. He didn't care. He was enthroned. They laughed at first. It felt like a victory. Look how well he's adjusting, they told themselves. But the illusion of normalcy frayed quickly. By the end of the second week, the scratch marks on the kitchen doorframe were more than cosmetic. Ash had decided it was a boundary worth testing daily. They installed scratch posts, logs, and thick sisal ropes wrapped around stair columns. Ash ignored them. He preferred the doors, and the couch legs, and the dining chairs. He doesn't scratch to play. Harold noted one afternoon, examining a fresh gash along the hallway molding. He's marking. Clara dove into research. Bobcats mark territory, not out of defiance but instinct. Even hand-raised ones often display territorial behavior as they age. She tried scent-masking sprays, pheromone diffusers, and hours of enrichment. Nothing worked consistently. Ash was calm until he wasn't. One evening, while Harold typed quietly in the den, a loud thwack echoed through the house. Ash had launched himself from the top of the bookshelf onto the curtain rod, which now hung limply at a 45-degree angle. He landed, looked satisfied, and slinked away. Then came the litter issue. Standard litter boxes Ash simply didn't fit. Larger ones. He rejected them. They tried sand trays, shallow bins, and outdoor-style gravel beds. Nothing stuck until Harold had the odd idea to repurpose a storage container and fill it with a mix of sand and pine needles. It worked. Ash, perhaps recognizing the scent of something familiar, began using it regularly. Clara dubbed it the forest room. But perhaps the most bizarre moment came one Tuesday afternoon. Clara had set out boiled shrimp, Ash's now favorite treat, and turned to grab something from the fridge. When she turned back, he was sitting at the table. Not on the table at the table. On a dining chair, front paws on the edge, staring at the bowl of shrimp like a guest politely awaiting service. She laughed until she cried. "This isn't a pet," she whispered to herself. "This is haunting." And yet, beneath the chaos, a pattern emerged. Ash would follow Clara from room to room, not with desperation but with presence. When she folded laundry, he sat nearby, his tail occasionally flicking against her ankle. When Harold tuned his camera or reviewed edits, Ash would curl up on the floor, just out of frame. He didn't demand affection. He was an eyewitness. There was a moment, brief, quiet, forgettable to anyone else, that Clara would recall later as sacred. She'd been sick one night, lying on the couch with a blanket and a dull ache in her chest. The lights were off. Rain tapped on the windows like a memory trying to return. Ash approached, not quickly, not with concern, just with quiet certainty. He climbed onto the back of the couch, lowered his body, and rested one paw gently across her shoulder. He didn't move for hours. Neither did she. Not everything worked. They lost 2 rugs, a coffee table, and most of the curtains in the guest room. Ash attempted to climb the refrigerator. He hissed at the vacuum like it was a rival predator. Guests stopped visiting. But in the silences between disruptions, something deeper grew. Ash began watching them as they watched him, and they began to understand that cohabiting with a wild animal wasn't about control, it was about negotiation. Each day a new line was drawn. Some were erased. Some were redrawn again. The wild doesn't disappear when you close the door. It sleeps in corners, listens through walls, and waits behind the couch. They learned slowly to listen to the rhythms Ash followed. When he disappeared into the hallway at dusk, he always returned by moonrise. When he stared too long out the window, they knew he missed the rustle of leaves beneath his paws. When he paced, they opened a door. They didn't tame him. They translated him. And in doing so, they discovered the limits of language, the edges of control, and the unexpected intimacy of silence. But even with all their efforts, one truth remained unshaken: Ash was growing, bigger, stronger, and older. And with age came a new layer, one they hadn't fully prepared for. A layer of instinct not softened by flannel or boiled shrimp, a shadow that sometimes flickered in his eyes when the wind changed direction. Next the day the forest called louder than their voices, and what happened when Ash answered? It started with a shift in the wind. One of those subtle changes that no one notices except the ones who've learned to live by it. Clara felt it first standing by the sink, hands deep in soapy water. The air grew heavy, not with cold, but with memory. It smelled like wet pine and something older, something like absence. Ash had been restless that day, not aggressive, just distant. He circled the perimeter of the house more than usual, paced. The window ledges sniffed the door cracks like he was listening for something the humans couldn't hear. He refused his midday shrimp. Harold joked that maybe Ash was finally developing taste. Clara didn't laugh. That evening, the fog rolled in thick and sudden, like a curtain dropped between the world of people and the world of trees. It swallowed the garden, blurred the porch railings, and muffled sound into a low hum. And somewhere between 7:14 and 7:23 p.m., Ash disappeared. The gate hadn't been left open, the fence hadn't been broken. But by the time Harold walked out to check on him, the outdoor enclosure was empty. No paw prints, no scratches, no sign of struggle, just silence. At first it didn't register. Ash had never strayed, not once, not even the day the neighbor's terrier barked through the wire. He had always returned, always come home. But this time the house felt too still. Clara called his name softly out of habit more than hope. Ash? Sweetheart? No response. Only the sound of wind curling through the fog. They searched the yard, first flashlights and hand boots crunching on damp gravel, then the tree line, then the old creek bed. No movement, no flash of golden eyes, nothing. And still that feeling lingered, not panic, but echo, like something had shifted quietly while they were washing dishes. Something old, something irreversible. Clara tried to keep calm. "He'll come back," she whispered over and over like a charm. "He always comes back." But when midnight passed and the mist hadn't lifted, her voice began to crack. At 2 a.m., Harold walked the ridge behind the property alone. The flashlight in his hand flickered with dying batteries, but he barely noticed. He stopped once, hand on an old pine, and whispered into the dark, "If you've gone back to the trees, just tell me. Just let me know you meant to." Still nothing. Back home, Clara sat on the front steps, Ash's old blanket clutched to her chest. The stars were hidden. The world felt farther away than ever before. It wasn't until dawn that something shifted again. The fog thinned, the birds returned, and then, barely visible against the wet earth, a paw print, pressed beside the back porch heading east. Not erratic, not panicked, just one step, then another, then gone again. Harold followed the trail through the morning light. Less than a mile from the house, down by the edge of the gully, he found him. Ash was lying beneath a cedar tree, legs tucked close, breath slow but even. There was a fresh scratch above his eye and a thin line of dried blood on his side. But more than that, there was something changed in his posture. He didn't look wounded. He looked woken, like something ancient inside him had risen, stretched, and then quietly returned to sleep. He didn't flinch when Harold knelt beside him, didn't growl. He simply blinked once as if to say, "I needed to go." Harold wrapped him in the old flannel without speaking. Ash didn't resist. Later, after Clara had cleaned the wound and fed him by hand, they sat in the quiet of the living room. The fire popped. The clock ticked. Ash lay curled beside the hearth the same way he had the night they first brought him home. But the silence felt different now. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't hollow. It was humbled. That night, Clara said softly, "I think we don't own him. We never did. He just lets us walk beside him." And Harold, after a long pause, replied, "He needed to remember where he came from. And now, maybe so do we. There's a part of love that holds, and there's a part of love that releases." The lesson wasn't in bringing Ash home. It was in learning when not to stand in his way. They knew then that something needed to change. Not just their routines, but their space, their offering. Ash needed more than walls. He needed the sky. He needed options. In the next part of their journey, the Boones make a decision that will uproot their lives, but finally allow Ash to root into his. Some fences are built to keep things out, others are built to keep things in. But the one Harold and Clara Boone built wasn't really for either. It was for something quieter, something harder to name, a sacred space between what was wild and what was willing to stay. After the night Ash disappeared, something shifted permanently in their home. He had returned, yes, but in his eyes there lingered the shimmer of stars, something old and ungraspable, as if part of him had been called back by ancestral wind and shadow. The house felt smaller now. The walls are too close. The windows are no longer frames of safety, but barriers to breath. Clara said it first as she watched Ash sit perfectly still on the porch, staring out into the tree line like it was whispering his name. "We either let him go, or we give him a place where he doesn't have to choose." And so they did. They sold the house in town, said goodbye to the garden that had grown with them for 10 years, packed up their memories and their uncertainty, and moved. The new land was quiet. 5 acres of rolling grass, thin woods, and one old shed that leaned slightly to the left, as if bowing to the weight of time. The sky was bigger here. The light fell more slowly. There was no gate at the end of the dirt road, no street lamps, just space. Space enough for a creature who remembered the rhythm of the forest, even while sleeping beside a wood stove. But moving wasn't the answer. The building was. They didn't want a cage. That was clear from the start. Ash didn't need captivity, he needed containment with dignity. So with the help of Dr. Nora Finch, a wildlife behaviorist, with more patience than any of them expected, they began to design a habitat. The fence was 8 feet tall with 6 feet buried underground, not because they thought Ash would dig, but because they knew one day he might. It surrounded a half-acre portion of the land, filled not with fake rocks and shallow attempts at nature, but with actual living things. Felled logs from nearby storms, natural boulders, tall grass patches that swayed like ocean waves in the wind. They redirected a portion of the seasonal stream to trickle through one end, adding flat stones for basking. Inside the enclosure, they planted wild herbs that grew naturally in bobcat habitats, sweetgrass, cedar, mugwort. Not just for scent, but for memory. Clara called it his remembering place. Ash watched it all with silent approval. He didn't test the walls. He didn't resist. The first time they opened the gate, he stepped through like he was stepping into something he had forgotten he missed. And in those first days, he bloomed. He stalked shadows again, climbed the low pine with startling grace, rolled in dry dirt like it had meaning. At twilight, he sat on the largest boulder and watched the wind pull secrets from the tops of trees. He didn't pace like a caged animal. He inhabited as if the space spoke back to him. Harold set up a chair nearby and often sat for hours, camera idle on his lap. He didn't need photos anymore. He just needed to witness. And sometimes Ash would pat over brush against his leg, not as a thank you, but as a reminder, "I know you see me." Clara noticed his behavior change within days. Less marking, less restlessness. His eyes softened. He still had the occasional wild burst, a deer caught on the wind, a squirrel along the fence line, but he returned to calm more quickly. His body had space, his instincts had room, and perhaps most of all, his heart had context. What Harold and Clara learned wasn't just about building an enclosure. It was about respecting the threshold between two worlds. Love wasn't about softening Ash's wildness, it was about creating a space where it could live without hurting him or them. They still shared evenings indoors. Ash would come in after sunset, curl by the fire, and press his massive paws against the rug, like a prince returning from pilgrimage. But now he had a choice. And in giving him that, the Boones had freed themselves too from the anxiety of confinement, from the guilt of domestication, from the illusion that love means ownership. One afternoon, Clara found Harold carving something into the old cedar post by the gate of the enclosure. It was a quote from Miriam, Harold's grandmother. "Let the wild stay wild, and if it rests beside you, let that be a gift, not a possession." That night, Ash lay beneath the stars, his body silhouetted against the fence line, his breath steady as the night cooled. The crickets sang, somewhere in the trees an owl called. And inside the house, Harold and Clara sat quietly, not speaking, their hands loosely touching hearts, steadier than they'd been in months. They had built a fence, but it had become a bridge. What they didn't know was that this story, though finally at peace, had begun to echo beyond their woods. In the final chapter, we'll see how Ash's presence, caught in photographs, stories, and quiet awe, would ripple outward and inspire more than just two people to see the wild not as a threat but as a teacher. Ash never purred like a house cat, though sometimes late at night when the wind was quiet and the fire still warm, he'd emit a low, steady rumble from somewhere deep in his chest. Not quite a purr, not quite a growl, something older. Something that felt like the echo of trees, of running streams of soil that remembers every footfall. By the time Ash turned 3, he had become as much a part of the Boone home as the floorboards or the scent of pine wood that lingered in the hallway. He still slept by the fire most evenings, often curled in a tight ball with his tail flicking in his dream. He still woke them at 5 in the morning, tapping the floor with those thick, deliberate paws, not out of mischief but out of rhythm. He still demanded his shrimp peeled just so, and could hear the sour cream container opening from across the house. But Ash was no longer the fragile creature they had once wrapped in flannel. He was a force, not tamed, not controlled, simply understood. His days were divided: mornings spent indoors, afternoons in the enclosure, evenings somewhere in between. There were routines now, rhythms they had grown into like old clothes. Clara would hum while preparing his meals, not to soothe him, but to ground herself. Harold stopped photographing him, not because Ash was any less majestic, but because some things grow too sacred to capture. Visitors rarely came, not everyone understood. Some thought the Boones were foolish, others romanticized it too much, but neither was right. Living with Ash wasn't about a fairy tale bond with a wild animal, it was about learning how to hold something that cannot be held. It was about listening to silence, respecting boundaries that had no signs, and showing up every day, willing to be changed. There were challenges. There always would be. One morning, Ash found a weakness in the enclosure, just a small gap where rain had softened the earth and slipped out. Clara found him 3 hours later on the roof of the old barn, watching the horizon like it was telling him a story. He came down when she called, but not because of obedience, because of choice. That became the theme of their bond, not training, not mastery, but mutual willingness, a dance between autonomy and trust. Over time, Ash taught them more than any book or class ever had. He taught them that love isn't always soft. Sometimes it hisses. Sometimes it disappears into the trees without warning. Sometimes it comes back with blood on its paws and needs space before it can curl at your feet again. He taught them that healing is never linear. Some days, Ash would play like a kitten, eyes wide, tail twitching. Other days, he would sit in the far corner of the yard, unmoving, watching the sky for hours. And both were valid. Both were real. He taught them that coexistence doesn't mean compromise. It means honoring difference. To truly love something wild, you must first accept that it may never love you back in the way you expect. But it might love you in the way it knows how. And in doing so, Ash gave them a gift neither of them had known they were missing. Harold began writing again, quiet essays, reflections he never shared, but that filled his notebooks with clarity. Clara started speaking at schools and wildlife centers, sharing their story not as a manual, but as a mirror. "We didn't save him," she would say gently. "We just gave him space to choose." Their story spread, first locally, then farther. A small blog post became a feature. A photo of Ash in the snow, his breath visible, eyes locked on the camera, won an award. Not because of its technical brilliance, but because of what it stirred in people: awe, humility, remembrance. Because in Ash, people saw something they had forgotten how to see in themselves, the part of us that still belongs to the woods. The part that's not interested in perfection or obedience, but in truth. The part that longs not to be tamed, but to be trusted. And maybe that's the greatest lesson of all. Love at its most sacred is not about softening claws. It's about being willing to sit beside them unafraid. To offer your hand not to capture, but to share space. To say you don't have to change who you are. "I'll stay right here while you remember yourself." Ash never spoke, of course. But every look, every quiet return, every paw pressed gently to the earth seemed to carry the same message: "Thank you for not asking me to become something I'm not." And in turn, Clara and Harold whispered back in all the ways they could: "You don't have to give us more than that. You already have." So now, as the sun sets over the hollow and the trees turn golden with the weight of another season, Ash lies stretched on the porch, blinking slowly and easily. And somewhere inside the house, a kettle sings, a camera rests, and two people smile because they know what it means to love something wild and to be loved in return, not perfectly but truthfully. And maybe that's all any of us ever really hope for. You made it to the end of this bobcat's journey. That alone is a gift. If you'd like to give one back. Super thanks is just a quiet way to say, "I was here, I cared." If the story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of your wildness or someone you once had to love from a distance, let it stay with you. And if you'd like to walk beside more stories like this, we invite you to subscribe, to share, or simply to sit quietly with what you've just felt. Because some stories aren't meant to be consumed, they're meant to breathe with you.